I'm a psychologist, and I'm in private practice in Waco.
Okay. And you're in Waco. It's 100 miles away from here. Do you commonly appear in this and other courts to testify?
Yes, I've testified in approximately 25 or 26 different counties in Texas.
Okay.
Travis County is one of them I come to fairly often.
Do you testify both on behalf or on the request of the state and of the defense?
Yes, I do. I am more commonly a prosecution witness. I very often testify in child sex abuse cases. That's one of my big specialty areas, but I testify in other matters as well.
Okay. Have you ever consulted or testified in a capital murder type case?
Yes.
On both sides or on the defense side?
Actually, I've consulted with prosecution on capital murder cases, but I've never testified in a murder case for the prosecution.
Okay. But have you testified for the defense in some other capital murder cases?
Yes.
Okay. What is your professional background? You said you're a psychologist, is that correct?
Yes.
What's your professional background to the jury business?
I finished graduate school in 1982, and just for the record, I have a doctoral degree in counseling psychology from Baylor University that I finished in 82. I was then licensed, and I've been in practice since 1983. I've always done psychological evaluations as a large part of my practice. My practice work has included work experience in psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment centers, outpatient clinics. I'm currently in an outpatient clinic, and I only do psychological evaluations and court-related testimony. I do about 300 evaluations per year. In the last few years, I have testified in court approximately 40 times a year on various kinds of cases, and I consult on a number of other cases that never make it to court.
So you testify almost once a week?
Yes.
Okay. And you indicated your educational background is that you're a doctor. You're a doctor of education.
Yes.
What is that as opposed to a PhD or PsyD or something?
They're all equivalent degrees in that they are terminal degrees. They require a dissertation. They're beyond the master's degree. My degree was issued through a school education. At the time that I went through graduate school, Baylor University had a very strong counseling psychology program that was headed by a psychologist who later became the dean of that program, and I was his graduate assistant. And we had several psychologists on staff, and so on the teaching faculty, and so that was the program through which I got my degree. After I started getting called into court a lot, especially during the late 90s, I have done a lot of retraining in forensic psychology, and I've completed over 300 hours of continuing education in that field.
Since what time?
Since the late 90s.
Okay. And so what sort of training do you get for forensic psychology?
Well, you have to take continuing education classes every year, just as a requirement of my state board. But I have been qualified to do competence exams and sanity examinations. I've taken various courses which are equivalent to graduate level courses in just forensic psychology in general and in specific areas related to forensic work. I mentioned that I do testify a lot in child sex abuse cases, and so much of my continuing education is in that field as well.
And does forensic psychology essentially just mean psychology where it's designed and intended to be used in court?
Yes.
As opposed to clinical psychology, which means what?
Clinical psychology would be psychological studies that are used primarily in an outpatient or inpatient setting. One of the interesting things I find is that I've evaluated people in many, many different settings, schools, psychiatric hospitals, residential treatment centers, juvenile detention centers, foster care settings, prison settings, jail, and you find that people are people. And when you evaluate people, wherever the setting is, you tailor your diagnostic findings to whatever the diagnostic question is. but you're essentially evaluating many of the same people, same characteristics, qualities, and so forth, regardless of the setting you're in.
And did you have an opportunity in this particular case to interview Brandon Daniel?
Yes, I did twice. I'm sorry I don't have the specific dates. Both of them have been in 2014. The first time I saw him was at the county jail approximately the second week or so of January. I then saw him again at the county jail about 3 weeks ago. It was, I think it was in early February or late January that I saw him again for a couple hours. The first time I saw him for about 4 hours.
And that was at my request. It was not the state's request or the court's request.
Correct.
Let's deal with that directly. Are you a person who provides an opinion that is different based on who it is that's asking you for the opinion?
No, I try to be as objective as I possibly can. I understand that because I have been hired by the defense, I would be inclined to look at matters from a defense standpoint, but anytime I take on a case, I try to look at it from both sides, from the prosecution standpoint as well as the defense standpoint. And you know, as well as I do, that the prosecution will cross-examine me, and I will respond as openly as I can to their questions and look at matters from their perspective as well.
Fair enough. So in addition to interviewing Brandon Daniel, I provided you with a number of documents you were able to review.
Yes.
Can you give the jury an idea about what other documents you reviewed?
I have reviewed the Austin police records, over 600 pages of such. I did see the Walmart surveillance video of the index offense. I saw a transcript of the police interview that he conducted, or that was conducted with Mr. Daniel shortly after the offense, and had an audio recording of that as well. I saw the Breckenridge medical records, Mr. Daniel's historical records, including college transcripts, college disciplinary records, college employment records, some high school disciplinary records, his high school transcript, the offense records regarding previous contact with law enforcement in Colorado, and then I read transcripts from grand jury testimony by two females that were connected to Mr. Daniel.
So Nikki Nance and Jenna Phelan, is that correct?
Correct.
Correct. So in giving your opinion and your evaluation of Brandon Daniel, you're not solely relying on what Brandon Daniel reported to you. Is that accurate?
Yes, and obviously when I spoke with Mr. Daniel, it is assumed that I was getting a biased presentation. I always assume that when I interview a person, but of course
What do you mean by that?
We all tell our history from our
Do you feel like that would assist you in more clearly expressing your evaluation with the jury?
Yes, in doing this, it gives me some structure as to what I would like to say as it regards my testimony. Hopefully, it gives you some structure to regarding what kind of points we can cover, and hopefully, then it gives the jury some structure as to what kinds of things I consider when I go through an evaluation process.
Fair enough. So we'll move to the first PowerPoint slide, which deals with Brandon's childhood family life. Are you able to read that?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the first PowerPoint, or the first bullet point talks about his general background, is that correct?
Yes.
And so explain what the first bullet point is.
Whenever I do a study of a person, I want to know what their personal history is and their family history. Sometimes it may seem that those kinds of details aren't that particularly important. I actually want to get a big picture view of an individual, and so I do ask questions about their family of origin. I was told and saw in records that he's the oldest of two children who were born to both the same mother and father. His sister is 6 years younger than he, and in some ways the siblings were raised almost as two only children, meaning the age difference between them was such that they didn't have a lot of overlap in their development, and their peer groups would have been different and so forth.
Okay. And you go on to describe where he was born and raised.
Yes, my understanding is that he was born in Kansas, and he still has relatives there, but he was raised primarily in Colorado. After his parents divorced, he lived alternately with both parties.
And you talked about there was a divorce in the family.
Yes.
Is that significant from a psychological perspective? Can it be?
Yes. I mean, obviously, divorce is something that occurs with frequency. Some children get through it without a lot of scars or damage. Others are hurt by it. But I see that as a particularly interesting point.
Okay. And in this case, you indicated that there was a real difference in the parenting and personality styles of the parents.
Right. Mr. Daniel told me, and from reading between the lines of some of the records I reviewed, his mother was identified as the more domineering parent, and that's neither good nor bad, it's just simply the way it is. But she had a stronger personality than the father. Brandon described his mother as intimidating, and he described his father as more passive.
Okay. What about his personal connection to his family members, either his parents or his sister? How do you describe that?
He indicated that the family connection between himself and each of his three family members is not particularly strong. He stated, "I've never been connected to family." He learned to ignore family as he aged. He emotionally withdrew. Again, there is evidence in records that would suggest that that is true. The way that he withdrew and came into his own, or withdrew into his own world, beginning in early adolescence or pre-adolescence, would suggest that statement may be based on true historical fact.
And do you have a background in working with adolescent development issues?
Yes.
Explain that to the jury.
I do evaluations of people of all ages, from literally preschool on up to, I don't know what the oldest person I've evaluated, but probably in the 80s. But I evaluate many children and teenagers, including teenagers who commit juvenile offenses, kids who are in foster care. I do evaluations of those, and so I have considerable experience with that age level, and as such, I need to be cognizant of and aware of developmental issues.
And is there something about that adolescence period that has particular relevance to this sort of connection within the family?
Yes. We consider the adolescent years as being a time when identity really starts to take shape. Now, in actuality, at every stage we find ourselves in life, we are asking the question, who am I? What are my beliefs? How do I relate to people? How do I handle my emotions and so forth? But during the teenage years, one's identity and sense of self becomes extremely important, perhaps more so than at any other stage in life.
Okay. So it's during that time period that you said Brandon withdrew to a certain extent.
Each time I saw him, he made several references to the fact that during that 11 to 13 age range is when he realized that he was going to a dark place. And he made several references each time I saw him to that being a pivotal time in his life.
And the last bullet point talks about contact with other relatives, extended family. How is that significant?
When a person does not have much contact with relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and so forth, that says something about their sense of belonging to a family system. In this particular case, Brandon told me that he did not have much interaction with extended family members. It was just mostly him, his mother, his father, and his sister, and he wasn't too connected to them, which tells me something about his emotional isolation and the lack of pro-social support system.
Then the next area that you had indicated we could discuss is his childhood personality. Looks like at first you're talking about how he's not inclined toward behavior problems as a child.
Yes, now much of this came directly from him, although we don't have any records from elementary school suggesting that he was a discipline problem at that age level, so I'm assuming that it's correct that he told me that he was not inclined toward behavior problems. He was generally quiet, which fits his introverted manner and what he showed me. He was well behaved. He had some friends as an elementary age boy, but he was not a real social kid.
Okay. And did that change at some point during this adolescent period?
He indicated, so far as social contact?
I guess going from being sort of a happy, well-adjusted seeming child to, with friends, to some other kind of situation.
I don't know that I would say that Brandon was ever a happy, bubbly, outgoing kind of kid. He is introverted by nature, and per his own description of himself, he was just a quiet boy who didn't rock the boat, but he was not a socially involved or active boy. I think that he probably had some dissatisfaction with life as a younger child, but during that pre-adolescent stage, say 11, 12, 13 years of age, is what he identified as a particularly pivotal point in his life that he fell into a pretty deep depression, and school records would corroborate that.
So this bullet point says he wasn't happy as a young boy, but the depression became serious around 6th grade or age 12.
Correct.
And do you find that in folks who we later learn are depressed, that depression has an onset of this kind of age or something significant of this age range?
In looking at him from a psychological standpoint, the term introversion means something to me. Individuals who are introverted tend to keep their thoughts and feelings to themselves just by nature, and that's neither good nor bad.
Let me stop you. So is introversion is it a value judgment, or is it just how you present to the world?
Yeah, it has to do with how you present to the world or how you relate to other people. And some people are born much more extroverted and loud, and you can see it when they're 2 years old, and others are quiet from very early on, and you can see it in their early childhood development. Some introverts become more extroverted as they age. I don't know that Mr. Daniel ever became too extroverted. He's always been the type, I think, to keep his thoughts and feelings private.
And that's really what extroversion or introversion means. You keep your thoughts and feelings private.
Yes.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, you were talking about if that onset at age 12 or so is important.
Yes, and I think you asked, is that common? I don't know that I would say common. It's not uncommon, because depression doesn't necessarily follow the same route in its development in each person. But given that he was a quiet boy who kept his thoughts to himself, did not feel well connected for assistance in that regard.
And do you find it's more common that boys in particular are not encouraged to express those feelings with other folks?
That's a stereotypical statement, and there may be some truth to that. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say that just because he's a boy, he would have difficulty expressing his feelings. It may have played a role.
Is there anything about the family dynamics that would make it difficult for him to express his feelings?
If he did not feel that his voice was heard, or that there was a lot of strength in his mother-son, father-son relations, that certainly could play a role in his fall into depression, because he didn't feel that he had any outlet for troubled feelings.
Even as early as 12, 13 years old, is it possible to get psychological treatment for depression?
Certainly.
And do kids that are that young, are they able to respond to treatment?
Yes.
When you were in clinical practice, did you ever talk to kids that were that young?
Oh, yes.
When we think of little kids, we think of them as these happy little creatures. Are they universally happy, or do they sometimes fall?
Children do the same things adults. Their emotions ebb and flow according to life experiences and according to their own personality type. Some kids do have major depression, and that's not uncommon, in the same way that an adult can have major depression.
Now, when you say major depression, what is that a term of art? What exactly does that mean?
There are different kinds of depressions. We refer to moderate depression. The term is dysthymia. A person can be depressed because of an adjustment to life stressors, and that's a lesser form of depression and typically is short-lived. Other children who've been through a lot of trauma or who have a particularly difficult disposition may experience depression that is strong and enduring, and so we would refer to that as a major depression that's chronic.
And do sometimes people, even children, self-medicate to try to cope with those feelings of depression?
Children don't often self-medicate as they move into the adolescent years. It would not be as uncommon, and one of the things I noted with him is that he did begin experimenting with drugs at an early age. Junior high is pretty young to be experimenting with drugs, and I think from what I understand from him, he found drugs to be some way that he could escape because it gave him some sense of relief from his depression.
And that was as early as age 12 or 13?
Yes.
Did his relationships then change as a preteen or as an early teen?
He indicated to me that he never really had a lot of friends, some acquaintances, but nobody that he would consider a best friend type person. I don't think he believed that he fit in. As I noted on the PowerPoint, he had occasional short-term friendships, but none were lasting. He tended to keep to himself. His motivation towards social contact was low. He avoided people. He was not an emotionally expressive person. I define that as humorless. He was serious, often alone.
Is that more related to his introversion, more related to his depression, or are the two interrelated?
I think it's a combination of all those factors, plus his lack of social support.
Okay. You indicate engaging in Gothic dress and these dark thoughts.
Yes, he indicated to me that as a teenager he did go through phases where he would dress in a black attire. He was attracted to that Gothic thinking. When I think of Gothic, I think countercultural. Internally, there's probably some anger, some bitterness, and so forth towards life at large, people at large, and you oftentimes see kids who are drawn to anything that is anti-establishment or anti-normal, and I feel that he fell into that mode, and so probably this move into what kids refer to as a Gothic lifestyle was his way of saying, I feel rejected, therefore I'm going to reject others just because I can.
Okay. So you summarized here saying, it sounds like you're saying it starts with deficient family attachments. What does that mean?
Anytime one looks at a person's emotional and psychological development, it's important to look at the quality and nature of their attachments, that is, their emotional connections, specifically to family members and friends, and his attachments were not particularly strong. I saw them as deficient.
Okay. Then, so that's not just family attachments, it's friends as well?
Right, lacking in friends. I felt that he fell into depression probably in childhood. At least we saw the beginnings of depression. I felt that he was a confused boy without an internal compass, meaning not knowing where he was going in his teenage years, and he did the best he could to just simply struggle from one day to the next.
Does a child experience depression in a different way than an adult does?
Yes, simply because we're developmentally different and we don't have the capacity to understand life at a perspective that an adult could understand it. But children can experience sadness, frustration, irritability, loneliness, and so forth in the same way that an adult can.
And is it your sense that that describes Brandon's experience of life at this age?
Yes.
So let's move then into his late adolescence, earlier, his early childhood at this point. This slide seems to talk about how that early depression reflected itself in his later life.
Right.
So first bullet point talks about education.
Right. I was a bit surprised to hear from him that he did not actually finish high school, but he did get a GED and then went on to college. He went to Colorado State University, which is a good school, got a degree in computer science and math. He had good jobs while he was a college student and got a good job after he completed college, and he came to work for Hewlett-Packard here in Austin, which is how he came to Travis County.
So despite the fact that he has depression issues that he's dealing with, he's able to overcome those and get a good job.
Yes.
And is that sometimes a way that a person who is suffering from depression will deal with that depression? If they're not being medicated, they may immerse themselves in work?
Possibly. I don't know that I would say that he was dealing with depression through work, but he managed to do fine in school and to get good jobs in spite of the fact that he had all of these internal struggles.
Is there a difference between a person who is it possible to be a person who is terribly depressed but is also highly intelligent and even successful in what they're doing?
Yes.
How can a person reconcile this?
A person might not be doing well internally, but they can hold it together enough to do big things from a work standpoint. One of the best examples I can offer is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln suffered from major depression and yet is considered one of the greatest presidents that we've had in our history. So a person can suffer from depression and yet manage to keep that to an aside and still be able to do good things in a work environment.
In Brandon's life, did he learn, in addition to working hard, did he learn some negative responses to his depression, specifically in self-medication?
I do think that he engaged in increased drug and alcohol use during the adolescent years, mostly marijuana and alcohol, but he also engaged in some other harder drugs. And he explained to me that he liked the feeling associated with that, and that it did help to self-medicate against depression. My note there is that substance abuse interfered with his emotional and social development.
What does that mean?
Well, he may have been protecting himself from some of his own depressive symptoms through the use of drugs or alcohol, but by doing so, he was by default hurting himself as it regards his social development and even his emotional development. He was not dealing openly with things that were hurting him on the inside.
So he's insulating himself from the internal pain, but that also incidentally insulates himself from the world, so he can't grow.
Yes, it's a good way of putting it.
What about, you talked about attachment issues in relationships. How does that affect his relationships when he's a teenager?
He explained to me that he really had no real close relationships as a teenager. He said he didn't have girlfriends, didn't really feel that he belonged anywhere. He recalled feeling lonely and isolated.
Okay. How did that affect his self-confidence? As
a result, he didn't have a lot of self-confidence. Self-esteem was weak, more than might be evident, and by that I mean to the public at large. He felt insecure, pessimistic, maladjusted. He feared criticism and rejection. One of the things I saw in records that seemed to be a common theme in Mr. Daniel is that he sometimes tried to be somebody he's not by bragging, by pushing the limits, by saying things about him to make you know and realize how smart he is, that sort of thing, which I thought was or I would interpret as an overstatement of his importance. If other people don't see it, he wants to make sure that he points it out to them.
Fair enough. At some point, he gets sent off to this military school.
Yes.
Does he stay at the military school?
No, and I don't know how long he actually stayed. It wasn't long. Apparently his parents felt that they needed to send him off to a new world, a new environment to see if somebody else could do something with him. So he goes to stay with an aunt, or he goes to a military school and at some point stays with an aunt who parenthetically I think is a DA or an attorney in Wichita, Kansas. But that doesn't work out. He leaves. Whether you call that a runaway or what, he left and came home. And I think it's as a result of that he quit school.
Okay. And there, you had another indication that that's, to him, even more feeling like he doesn't belong anywhere.
Right. This experiment going to another state or going back to his parents' homeland and seeing if other relatives could do things with him that were productive, that didn't work out. And when you have those kinds of failures, you start feeling like you are a failure indeed.
So somebody who is depressed to begin with senses and feels that rejection gets even more depressed.
Correct.
You indicate here power struggles with adults continue. That I guess was after he leaves his aunt's house. Is that correct?
Right, and not only with family members, his mother in particular, but other authority figures, including police. His thumbing his nose at the law, speeding whenever he wants, doing whatever he wants when he goes to college, despite disciplinary warnings, that sort of thing.
And running away from the police on his motorcycle.
Correct.
You indicate punishment seemed continual, so he had nothing to lose by being defiant. But much of defiance is internalized and fuels his depression. What does that mean?
One of the things that people in general do is that we do what we can to stop a person from hurting themselves. It's not uncommon if any of us are parents for us to try to encourage and reinforce and talk positively to a young person about their need to change. But if that doesn't work, we start putting restrictions on them, and we get punitive, and we criticize, and sometimes we can lose sight of the fact that by doing so much of that, we're actually making matters worse rather than better. And in my opinion, that's what happened to him. He was in this constant struggle with others. He felt that he was criticized way more than he was reinforced or praised. He felt that punishment seemed inevitable, so if it's inevitable, why not do what I can and see what I can get away with? It's his way of striking back.
Now, we're not saying that he's not personally responsible for the things that he did, are we?
Correct.
But does this help to explain why he might have made some poor choices running from the police and that?
Correct.
What about psychological care? Did he ever have an opportunity to get psychological care as an adolescent?
My understanding is that there were several points during his adolescence that he engaged in some pretty serious misconduct or made threats to people. As a result, he was referred for psychological treatment. My understanding is he went to see a psychologist once, and that was about it, but he was never provided any kind of sustained psychological or psychiatric care that I'm aware of.
And with the person who's suffering from the kind of depression that he needs, does he need sustained care to be able to recover from it?
Yes. A lot of times when you do treatment, psychological treatment with teenagers, you may or may not see immediate results. I know when I would counsel families of teenagers, I would oftentimes tell parents, it may not seem that he's going to pop out of this depression immediately, but oftentimes a success in treatment for a teenager is to keep him propped up enough that he doesn't fall down so far that he falls in a hole that he can't climb out of. And then once they get into adulthood and have adult-like thinking, maybe then they can take over the reins and do some more of the work that they could not have done maybe as a teenager.
It looks like in the last bullet point you're talking about how he is tumbling toward that black hole that didn't go out.
That's how I see it, yes.
And can you explain what the bullet point said?
The depression continued, not only unabated, but I think it probably worsened as he moved through his teenage years. He recalled to me that he felt suicidal with regularity, he felt helpless, he hated life as he knew it.
Okay, so let's move back to the relationships question. So here we've got the two females that we've heard testimony about, his relationship with these two gals, Jenna and then Nikki. Talk a little bit about his relationship with you and that person.
This is a young person. He explained to me that he met while he was a student at Colorado State University, and I think she was a student there as well. He liked her and still likes her. Even now, he spoke favorably of her. I think that he wishes that that relationship had continued. I think the fact that she liked him was something of a novel experience for him, and he liked it. Most people didn't like him, but she did. My own opinion is that he was not socially skilled enough to know how to go about making relationships work, and that probably contributed a lot to its failure.
And so, that's what you're saying in the second bullet point.
Yes.
Because of his family background, his depression, his having used all these substances, he's really not equipped to be in one.
Right, and when we spoke about that, he told me he understood that he was not good enough at meeting others' emotional needs, and for obvious reasons. If one's own emotional deficits are very deep, he spends so much time focusing on those that he can't give to others. I refer to it as an empty bucket. If his bucket is empty, he doesn't have much to give to others.
But at the same time, he did have a multi-year relationship with Jennifer.
We did stay with her for, upwards of 4 years or so.
Is that remarkable in terms of a person with not a great history of attachments to become strongly attached to a person so well?
Yes, or it's not surprising that he would latch on to somebody who accepted him and stayed with him. I'm sure he desperately wanted that and liked it very much, even though he didn't know how to promote health in that relationship.
There's the sort of breakup event toward the end of their relationship, and it sounds like what you're describing in this next bullet point is that they had conflict toward the end, and he wasn't able to work through that conflict.
Right, and his explanation to me was that it was his fault. He didn't know how to handle disagreements, and so they argued more than he would like. But his statement to me was that mostly it was me not being able to resolve conflicts very well.
Yeah. And what then was his reaction to the split from Jennifer?
I think that he probably was surprised that she ended it and ended it for good. His statement to me was that he fell into what he said was probably the worst depression I've ever felt. His mood state was no doubt worsened by the fact that he'd already been depressed, and this was a pretty common theme for him anyway. And so his one hope, or this great hope for a relationship and sense of belonging, fell through, and he saw himself going back into that dark world and probably fell pretty deeply into depression once again.
So we've used the term a lot, the dark world, depression. I'm sure most of the folks on the jury have not ever experienced that. What is a person's experience when they have major depression?
We speak in terms of darkness and light, good and evil, those kinds of things, and I think all of us are well aware of that internal struggle that's common to the human condition. We just speak of that, and there's a lot of I've talked about that in theological and philosophical circles and so forth. When a person falls into what I would refer to as a dark depression, nothing seems right about life. You often feel that you have nothing to look forward to in the future. We commonly think of depression as being sadness, and a person cries a lot and so forth. And there may be some of that. A lot of people who are depressed don't cry at all, and they sleep all the time, or don't sleep much at all. But they just feel that life doesn't have much going for them. And they become pessimistic. Many depressed people are irritable. They act out in various ways, or they withdraw emotionally from others, or they pretend to be someone they're not. It's not an emotionally comfortable state of being.
Okay. And so when a person is experiencing depression, are they always aware what's going on. Hey, I'm depressed, and this is not a normal mood state, or might they be so down that they're not able to recognize what's going on?
Oh, I think that most people who are that depressed know that this is not good and it's not normal, and they wish they weren't that way. But the overriding statement might be, but I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to get out of this.
And if that's the way you've always experienced your life from the time you're 11 or 12 years old, does that seem like something that's unusual, or that's just the state of things?
It's not uncommon for people with major depression to sometimes develop the belief that there's nothing I can do to make my situation better, and so they accept its inevitability.
And you say inevitability. Is that sometimes how folks are led to make the decision to end their own life through suicide?
Yes, and he told me that suicidal thoughts were never too far away from his mind, that he didn't like life, didn't really see much use for continuing, and so he had a lot of self-destructive thoughts.
After his breakup with Jenna, he starts running around with Nick, who we've heard testimony from. How would you describe that relationship and its effect on him?
Right. He referred to it as a rebound relationship. He was in Austin, had not lived in Austin a terribly long time, maybe a year or less, or 2 years. And he says that he never really loved her, but it was through her that he made some connections with people in the drug culture, and was able to get drugs through her or through people he met through her. And so it was a relationship that probably didn't do anything to improve his lot in life or his psychological state of being. And that's not a reflection on the young woman.
And there's also greatly ramped up drug use. Is that accurate?
Yes, and he acknowledged that to me.
Again, would you describe that as an attempt to self-medicate?
Probably so.
And how does that work? I'm terribly depressed. I'm very dark. How does taking Xanax, for instance, deal with it?
If you can take Xanax or anything else and it alleviates whatever emotional or even physical pain you feel, even for just a few hours, then great. That's a few hours of pain he doesn't have to worry about.
But is that really effective at actually medicating the source of the issue?
It doesn't do anything to take away the ultimate causes for depression. It does nothing to improve one's lot in life.
Okay. It just erases the pain for a short period.
Right.
You also indicate that he was using it regularly for a couple of months, including a week-long binge prior to this particular offer.
That's what he explained to me, yes.
And what is, if you know, a week-long binge, what's the significance of that in terms of a person's mental state at the end of that binge and where they are as an individual?
If it's true that he was abusing drugs pretty heavily, and at one point in time for several days he was real heavy into drug abuse, that can be a tip-off to us about how bad off he was at that particular point in time, that his depression was at a particularly low spot, and he saw no real value to living life as he did. As he had been. He fell into a completely irresponsible state of thinking and behaving.
And would you describe this as drug addiction type behavior, drug use?
I don't know that he had used drugs long enough to refer to him as dependent. He may have been dependent on marijuana. Apparently that use was pretty long-standing. The other drugs, I don't know that he used those continuously to the point that I would say he was addicted to, for example, methamphetamines or some other drugs. Xanax, which is the bars he used, that's a very powerful drug, and you can get hooked on that pretty quickly.
Okay. So would you say that this is this kind of drug use, is it purely hedonistic, where he's just doing it for an enjoyment, or is there some other benefit he thinks he's deriving?
I don't know that I would say that he was doing it for hedonistic purposes, and by that just being, living the good life and partying and so forth. He did some of that. My impression is that much of his drug abuse was connected to and related to his depression.
But now, is he aware that that's why he's doing it?
Oh, I don't know that he was consciously aware of it or not. If he were honest with himself and stopped and looked at himself, he might have been able to say, yes, I'm doing this because I'm depressed and I hate myself. But when one is in that level or at that level of despair, they don't do a lot of reflection and introspection.
So let's then talk to his the psychological state he was experiencing at the time our incident occurred. I don't know if the jurors can even read that because our font was small.
Mm.
He's still at a point where he's a super bright person. Is that correct?
Right. I think that when you describe him at the time, April of 2012, he is a very bright person. That's a starting point for understanding who Brandon is. I did not give him an IQ test, but based on his history, I assume he has an IQ in the 120 to 130 range, somewhere along in there. Good, strong IQ. There's no reason to believe that his cognitive capacity was ever weakened because of substance abuse or psychological disturbance, but I do think that his emotional sensitivity was dulled.
What do you mean by that emotional sensitivity?
His willingness and capacity, I would say willingness, to see things from points of view other than his own.
So, as an example, his interaction with Jenna where he might have been rude, or Nikki where he might have been rude.
Right. He knew it was rude, but I don't know that he was at a point of caring, really.
I'm sorry, say that again?
He knew he was being rude, but I don't know that he really cared because his mood state was so negative.
He just felt so terrible about himself and the world that it wasn't a big concern.
Correct.
Problems with self-esteem, talk about that.
I think that was something that was long-standing. I think it was present for sure at around the time of the index offense. His esteem was not strong. His concept or his view of himself was poor. I noted that his identity development was weak. His sense of who he is, where he belongs in life, and so forth, that was not good.
How does it affect his psychological state that he's still introverted and reserved, and the other things you mentioned on this next book?
The fact that he's introverted is neither good nor bad. I do see that as an enduring characteristic of his. If you had to name some of the common features that seem to pop up at most any stage in his life, it seems that introversion is one of them. But by that, I see it as being a problem in that he never had learned how to openly share his thoughts and feelings with others. In fact, I think he, in many ways, hid his thoughts and feelings from himself. And so his trust in others was weak. He didn't know how to ask for help. His expectations for himself were poor. His expectations for others were poor. And those dynamics certainly were evident at about the time of the offense.
What do you mean by that?
I think that he was in a low state of psychological functioning and just didn't expect much out of himself and didn't expect that many people would be able to help him pull out of this. And I don't know that it was an ongoing active thought process, but those are the thoughts that he was operating under at the time.
Is he still, as I understand it, reeling from his relationship failures?
Yes, he even mentioned that in his interview with police officers following the index offense. And I do think that the hurt he was feeling as a result of that failure from his relationship with Jenna was present, but also failures from other relationships from earlier in childhood, his family, and so forth.
Okay. And so you don't think that his saying, really, I was depressed because of the breakup with Jenna, is that you get the sense that that's just fishing around for some kind of an excuse to explain why it is that he did this?
I can't say that that was the only reason that he did what he did. It is one of many failures he has experienced in life. And of course, anytime you have a stressor like that, a sentinel event like that, that can create a tipping point opportunity, and it may have made him fall into a deeper depression. Whether it would last forever or he'd eventually come out of it, who's to say?
Okay. What about thought disorders? You notice any sign of thought disorders?
Yeah, one of the things you look at when you look at a person's mindset at the time of an offense, for example, is the presence or absence of a major mental illness such as a thought disorder. A thought disorder is something like a schizophrenia or a psychosis where he doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong. I do not see that there's any reason to believe that he was depressed to the point of psychosis or anything of that nature.
You indicate Brandon devalued and life seems tasteless. What do you mean?
I think he devalued himself. He devalued life. He saw himself as functioning toward the lower end of on the lower end of the ladder of life, that sort of thing. In other words, devaluing self, others' life was prominent with him. Life seemed tasteless. Now that quote there is my quote, as is a way of saying that he felt that life just didn't have much to offer, and it wasn't much value or good to him.
Now, at the time, are you referring to his own life, or referring to his opinion of the lives of others?
I think it's all mixed together. I think that the lack of significance he sees in himself also extended to others. He just did not like life, did not like himself, didn't like other people. He was just mad at everything and everybody.
Then he gets intoxicated. So what role is voluntary intoxication?
Well, obviously, since he was intoxicated by his own means, he can't hide behind that and say that I didn't know what I was doing because I was under the influence of some mental illness or aliens or whatever. In other words, he did it to himself. Obviously, though, intoxication did impair his judgment, and yet because of that, he can't be excused for his actions.
But that may help to explain his actions, certainly.
It's a mitigating factor that obviously we need to take into account.
And that seems obvious because the person under this terrible intoxication doesn't think the same as a person not under this intoxication.
Correct.
It doesn't have reactions that might be the same.
Correct.
A normal person.
Right.
What about, even though it's voluntary intoxication, you still think that is a mitigating factor?
Yes. But voluntary in the sense that I think that a primary reason he was drawn toward intoxicants, whether it's drugs or alcohol, was because of his internal psychological state.
Okay, and that's the last little point there, I think. He's not insane, but he's got this psychological disturbance.
Right. Texas doesn't have a designation of, guilty but mentally ill. I think that, however, that what he did was closely connected to his psychological disturbance, and at the very least we should think that played a role in his actions, and it should be taken into account in considering him.
So you mean but for his being in this terrible depressive state, that might have had some effect on whether this incident occurred?
That's a real simple statement, but I think that we can say that the fact that he is chronically psychologically disturbed, and I think at about the time of the index offense, he was acutely psychologically disturbed, that certainly played a role in what happened.
But is this chronic psychological disturbance something that can be treated through medication, through counseling?
Yes.
Through self-reflection?
Yes.
Let's talk about Brandon's personality characteristics. That's your next slide.
Okay.
You say that he's reserved in his emotional presentation. Is that the same as being introverted?
In this sense, that's what I'm referring to, that he does keep his thoughts and his feelings private. He does like it when people offer him understanding, when people around him are stable, when life is predictable and secure. But he doesn't know how to respond accordingly. In other words, some people who are shown a lot of kindness, they like it. but they don't know what to do with it because that's not a part of their norm and their normal experience, and it may take them some time to adjust.
Are you also saying that he's not emotionally expressive, but he does appreciate other folks who are interesting and show interest in him?
He was that way with me. When he first came into the room, the first time I saw him, he figuratively kept his distance from me. I think he was feeling me out in the same way that I was him. And when he saw that he was not necessarily being judged, he seemed to warm up and actually showed some of the favorable sides of his personality. And that was especially true the second time I came to see him.
Okay. What do you mean by favorable sides?
He smiled more. He initiated more conversation. And he wanted to make some kind of connection. I think he appreciated the fact that I was looking at life from his perspective. He's the kind of person that I could be bluntly honest with and say, this is what I see in you, this is what I'm likely to say about you when this particular day comes, meaning today. And he appreciated my candor.
Whether you're talking good things or bad things, he
Right.
appreciated the fact that you're telling him the truth.
Right.
That you indicate discernment within relationships. What exactly do you mean by that?
I think that he wants and needs to be involved in meaningful and positive relationships, and yet his discernment is weak, meaning his decision making in that regard is poor. He doesn't pick the right friends.
Does that mean he never should have run around with Mickey Nance? Is that what you're saying?
He should not be running around with people who are invested in the drug culture. I do not know that woman and don't know anything about her and don't want to say anything negative about her. But if she was a part of that world and that was one of the ways he was using her was to get to drugs or to party, whatever it was, that was a poor choice on his part, which is what I'm talking about his poor discernment.
Does that all rise out of family life that you mentioned last time?
Obviously, he's making a choice in doing so, but the preparation he had, if we can look at it that way, for making good decisions in adulthood certainly played a role in those decisions.
Okay. And so you're saying in his family life, he didn't learn how to emotionally support other folks.
Right. He felt that people who should have loved him and supported him failed him. In turn, he never learned how to give of himself to others.
The next point talks about his personal manner. And can you describe that?
Where are we?
Possesses an uncertain manner.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I see. Right. His feeling of low self-esteem and so forth causes him to be suspicious, cautious, cynical. And when I speak of his uncertain manner, I speak of his uncertainty about where he fits into the grand scheme of life and the grand scheme of of his social world.
I'm going to leap ahead just a tiny bit.
Sure.
We know that Brandon's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Does his being cautious and cynical and about relationships especially, is that something that may benefit him in a controlled environment like the penitentiary?
Restate that if you could so I can understand what you're getting at.
Sure. You indicate that his manner, although he's uncertain, he is suspicious and cautious about especially people he doesn't know. Is that a trait that might actually benefit him in a prison setting?
Oh, you mean being on guard for potential mistreatment? Yes, possibly.
Indicate he has a low need to please people, first keep to himself.
Right. His thought is that, what other people think, that's their business. What I think is my business. And that's not necessarily something that's hardwired in him. He feels that way because of life experiences, I believe. I think that he just feels like if you don't like what I'm doing or who I am, then just don't hang around me. Leave me alone.
But he still is suffering emotional pain.
Definitely.
And you indicate in your slide that the pain that he suffers may be stronger than other folks realize.
Right. I think he puts up a mask by, by being kind of impervious to pain or pretending that he doesn't care. And when I say pretending that he doesn't care, trying to convince himself that it doesn't matter or that I can push through it or life sucks anyway, so let's just live with it.
Right. And those are sort of bluster and bluff sort of statements that
Yes.
may not reflect the way you actually feel.
Correct.
Low need to control others, but doesn't want to be controlled by others.
Right. I don't know that he is the control freak type that is going to push himself on others at all times, or that he's going to be the type to take charge in relationships. In fact, his confidence in himself is not high enough that he would take charge or would take on leadership positions, voluntarily. That doesn't mean he can't lead if he needs to, but he doesn't voluntarily enter relationships with a need to control, but he does not like to be controlled by other people as well.
Is he capable of following a set of rules like the structure of the body?
I think he can.
We've had some testimony from the jail guards that say generally what he likes to do is just stay in his cell and not come out and socialize.
Right.
Is that consistent with your observation?
Yes.
You indicate that, when interpersonal troubles arise, his inclinations to withdraw and poor problem solver. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by poor problem solver?
By poor problem solver, I'm not necessarily meaning that he can't solve mental problems or verbal problems or put things together to make, a whole. By that I mean coping strategies. When relationship problems arise, he's not skilled at knowing what to do next and how to make things better. So when I'm saying poor problem solver, I'm talking about interpersonal problems.
Okay. Well, the next bullet talks a little bit about that. Generally respects other folks, but he'll defend himself as needs.
Right.
Can you talk to the jury about that?
Right. He's not necessarily a fighter, someone who goes out looking for a fight. He would, fight if he needed to. But I think his general rule of thumb is if you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone.
So he's not overly concerned with what the other folks think about him, but he doesn't want to be hurt either.
Correct.
Not narcissistic in the form of conceit. I'm not sure that I understand that.
We refer to narcissism as a focus on self. Oftentimes, if a person is conceited, we refer to them as a narcissist. A person can have a self-focus and not necessarily be conceited. If a person's emotional needs are unmet and they feel that they are devalued in relationship to others, they focus heavily on themselves, and as I said earlier, their bucket is empty, therefore they can't give much to other people, and they come across as self-centered. That's a true observation and an accurate observation, but it's not necessarily because he's all puffed up and thinks he's all that necessarily. It's because his deficits are so big that he doesn't have much to give to others.
Okay.
So by default, he is self-serving.
So, and that goes along with having difficulty stepping outside of himself and into other people's points of view.
Right.
So, am I correct in saying a person with that psychological landscape may not recognize the hurtfulness of statements that he makes, which would be offensive?
Right. I think if it's pointed out to him, he could say, yeah, I can see why a person might be bothered by what I just said or did, but at the time, he's not thinking much about that.
Okay. Possible that he may have intended statements to wound others, but then may not understand the depth to which those statements were.
Correct.
All right. So you've talked about it here, putting Brandon's life into perspective, specifically with the conclusions we draw when we hear about things like this terrible incident and differentiating children from adults who are acting out. Can you just discuss this slide with me?
Whenever I hear of events of this nature, I perk up. When I hear of news events about a murder, for example, because I'm always interested in, well, what was that all about? Our knee-jerk reaction is to think that that's terrible. This person needs to fry. He must be an awful animal type person, and so forth and so on. One of my experiences is in psychiatric hospitals, jails, prisons, and so forth, that I actually meet some pretty nice people in those places, but they've done some pretty awful things. We talk about children who do bad things as being victims. They're that way because life has not given them what they needed.
So like young Brandon in Colorado, who is terribly depressed and the world is dark, that child we think of as a victim.
Correct.
But with the adult Brandon, we tend to think differently.
Right, which I think is an interesting way for us to look at people. We feel bad about kids who need to be helped. We want to help them. We, might say, well, I've got an empty bedroom in my house. He can come stay with me and let me see what I can do with him. And that may very well have been what his aunt was thinking when she received him into her home in Kansas. And yet, we always want to help the troubled child.
But we don't necessarily feel the same way about the adults.
When that troubled child becomes an adult and acts out and does terrible things, then we might feel sorry for him, but we don't want our kids hanging around him. We don't want him to be the kind of person that we associate with. We think that he's probably not going to change. There's nothing that can be done for him to appreciate, how he can be helped by others.
So what about the capacity for change? That's your last bullet point. That's a really important topic, I think. What kind of capacity does someone of Brandon's makeup have to change?
We often assume that people like Brandon will remain the same forever, that nothing will change as they age. One of the best things that's happened to me from a professional standpoint is in the last, say, 8 years or so, I've been out in prisons and been doing evaluations of those individuals, and you do see that people can make adjustments to who they are. They may have the same core structure to their personality, but they may not be as angry as they once were. They may have a perspective that they did not have 5, 10, 15, 20 years earlier, and so forth. In other words, people can move along that continuum of development, and they can go either up or down.
And so some people who go into a custody facility, for instance, would you say it may take them a period of months or even a year more to make the adjustment from the person they were before they were in custody to the person they're going to have to be while they're in custody?
Right, and it's not necessarily a process that you can see, change from day to day, but over a course of time, you can certainly see those changes. 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you can examine the thoughts, the emotional expressions of that person, and compare them to what he had in the past and what he believed and who he was, a few years earlier, and you can see some marked differences.
And in your observations and your personal opinion of Brandon, is he a person who has the personal resources to be able to make positive change over a period of time?
Personal resources in the sense of intelligence, intuitive capacity, yes, he has those.
The next slide we talk about here has to do with his strengths and his weaknesses.
Right.
Now, the font is very small. Can you see that?
Yes, I can see it.
First one, quiet, reserved, and introverted. We talked about that.
Right.
Not drawing attention to himself.
Right.
Generally speaking.
Right.
Would like to find contentment in relationships, even if he's not skilled in interpersonal issues.
Right. He wants to belong.
Okay. So even how does that apply in a prison environment?
It's interesting how he will have the opportunity to develop a peer group. He can join a prison gang if he wants, or he can stay clear of those. He'll probably be assigned a job. He can put his heart into it or not. He can get along with those whose care he's entrusted to, or he can fight them. He has choices to make, in other words, about the relationship he develops once he's incarcerated.
Okay. And you're saying the choices that, from his personality standpoint, psychological standpoint, he wants to belong and wants to fit in.
Correct.
But he defines himself by his accomplishments, not necessarily by his relationship.
Right. An individual like him who's not necessarily an emotionally sentimental type person or a real touchy-feely kind of guy is not going to necessarily define himself by who he's connected to, but by what he has done and how smart he is and so forth. And so that's how he defines himself, is by those external markers.
And is it possible that somebody like him will be able to go to the penitentiary and be able to study mathematics, be able to study other academic disciplines, be able to develop his artwork, and be able to personally develop in that manner rather than hooking up with the wrong crowd?
Correct.
You said lives within a small world, which I think is similar to what we were just talking about. What does that mean?
Correct. He does not, as I finished out that statement, I said he usually does not make demands on others. That can be good in that he, when he is in a good place, does not necessarily make a lot of noise. He's not the kind that attracts a lot of unwanted attention. If you treat him well, he'll follow the rules and so forth, even though I know he's capable of testing limits.
Of course. Wishes to be dependable and conscientious about daily responsibilities. What is the significance of that?
He likes doing the things he enjoys, art things, his work, and in spite of his depression and his drug impairment, he managed to do his work with Hewlett-Packard or other places, and because that's one of the ways he defines himself.
Okay. Likes exploring ideas,
Right.
mission to create about.
Right, right.
Capable of accepting candid feedback, like you discussed earlier.
Right, he did that with me.
Especially if convinced these people understand him, as,
Right.
as in your situation.
Right,
Doesn't hold grudges.
right.
Gives other people the freedom to be themselves. Why are those things important?
In the same way that he wants to be allowed to think freely, he gives other people that right too. And I think his position would be, hey, if you don't like me, that's your prerogative. We can just agree to stay on opposite sides of the room. And he doesn't necessarily begrudge people for thinking or feeling whatever they do about him.
But we're not, this is not a, I'm not just going to sing praises to Brandon. We'll talk about his weaknesses.
Sure.
And he does have weaknesses. Part of that, his introversion is that he tends to hold himself back.
Right, and I think what I would highlight here is that, we note that he's a quiet, reserved person that doesn't draw attention to himself. The flip side of that is he's not balanced in that regard, which is what we see in these weaknesses. He holds back a large part of himself. He's not good at navigating relationships. Anger can result as a result, and so forth.
Possible. That's possible with anybody that understands.
Yes.
Emotionally isolated manner can push people away. Are you referring to how he was at the end with Jenna?
Right, right. By ignoring people, they can feel that he is more into himself when he may or may not necessarily be, but they will feel that their needs are not being met.
Okay. And then that, as we talked about before, that's cyclical. Push people away,
Right.
feel isolated,
Right.
you're isolated, you're depressed.
Right, which lends itself into depression and anxiety and so forth.
Okay. So it's that being emotionally isolated and introversion that can lead to depression.
Correct.
If it's untreated, right?
Correct.
He may take ill-advised chances, you say.
Right, and I would attribute that to a devil-may-care attitude. If life is not going the way I want, oh well, what difference does it make if I try something and I fail? It can't be much worse than where I am already.
Is that partially related to the untreated depression, this sort of devil-may-care attitude?
Yes.
Okay, and what about?
If he's never had any reason to believe that life is going to get better and he hasn't been through constructive therapeutic relationships or intervention, he may not recognize or realize just how much he could help himself if he but would.
Okay. The next statement seems a little contradictory. He has trouble leaving bad relationships until an inevitable collapse occurs. I thought you said that he doesn't place a super high emphasis and importance on that.
Right. He wants to belong, and let's say he gets involved in a relationship that could have been good. For example, his relationship with Jenna, and yet he did not know what to do or how to go about making it better. So it goes bad. It's not his idea for them to break up. However, she just finally decides she's had enough of him and leaves, and so it collapses. And that's how the relationship ends from his perspective. It just collapsed.
Because he didn't have the insight to realize that it was about to fall apart.
Correct.
His uncertain identity makes him hesitant to give and receive true affection.
Correct. Not that he doesn't want to, but he's not had success in that way. And so if he does not know how to love himself, it makes sense that he would not do a good job of loving others as well.
But he does have the desire to be loved by others.
He would like that, yes.
It's not that he's so withdrawn from the feelings of others that he doesn't care what anybody else thinks.
Correct.
He would like to be approved of that.
Correct.
And probably have other folks appreciate that he's an intelligent person with
Correct.
creativity.
Correct.
Okay, so here we're back to the big picture. We're fairly close to the presentation. Again, you talk about children versus adults who do bad things.
Right. We refer to children who are hurt by adults as victims. We feel badly for them. We want them to have a better life. We wish they did. Those who victimize children are looked down upon. We want to help the emotionally isolated child. And there was a time when Brandon was that person.
But then when you're an adult, people look at it differently.
Right. Adults participate in a crime. We assume they should know better. The public may pity the likes of Brandon, but we look down on him for being a drug abuser, for being indiscreet in his choice of friends, for failing to get over his problems, and we hope that he will learn his lesson in prison, but we have our doubts.
And we wonder how that boy in Bullet 1
Right.
becomes the man in Bullet 2 who's done such a terrible thing.
Right, right, and yet that happens. So if we want to move on to the next bullet point, we try to comprehend why a young child acts and feels the way he does. We find it fairly easy to enter his innocent, even if it's an ugly world. Why? It's because kids are innocent, because they're redeemable, because they're capable of being rescued, easier to forgive, capable of change. And I pose those kinds of questions simply because I would say that anytime we consider the fate of another person, we need to ask ourselves these kinds of questions.
Whether they're a child or an adult.
Correct.
But it says, you're saying in the last bullet point, it's harder to ask those questions of ourselves when it's an adult. Is that fair?
I think it is, and there's a natural draw that most people have to kids. We can kind of understand why they may have done the bad things they do, but when they become an adult and they perpetrate negative acts, terrible acts, we try to understand how that adult man might act and feel as he does, and we do find it harder to understand his motives and easy to condemn him.
But is it still possible, going back to the previous bullet, that an adult is redeemable, for instance?
All of us can change, yes.
Okay. So we're all capable, you said capable of being rescued for children.
Yes.
Is it possible even in the adult situation a person can get help for their underlying issues?
Yes.
And can advance as a human being?
Yes.
And grow?
Yes.
So even as an adult, as a young adult like Brandon, he's still capable of change, capable of becoming a different, better person than he was before.
Right.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Okay. You have some concluding considerations then here.
Right.
And some questions for reflection that you've dealt with.
Right. And it's not necessarily that I want to answer these questions, but these would be questions that I would encourage jurors to take into consideration. So what would Brandon's personality development have been had he been properly nurtured throughout his childhood and his youth?
What do you mean by nurtured?
Nurtured in the sense of, without speaking badly of his parents, been properly loved, spent more time with him, entered his world, and so forth. He did not have the support, I think, that he would have optimally thrived under.
And if a person is raised in a family full of depressives who are untreated depressives themselves, what does that say in terms of how they're likely to be raised?
If parents are dealing with their own issues, however they deal with it, and there's not so much left over for their own kids, then obviously that's going to reflect in the quality of his emotional development.
So to use your analogy from before, if the parents' bucket is empty, they can't fill up the kids' bank.
Correct.
The next question for consideration is how would his adolescence have been different if he had sought some kind of treatment?
Right. Other people who were in his world recognize that this is a hurting boy. He's saying and doing things that raise red flags, and they encouraged his family to get help. It did not happen. We obviously can wonder. So, what would he have been like had he gotten the kind of help he needed from an earlier age as opposed to later in life?
And I can't recall whether you were able to see any of the records of his early suicide attempts.
I was aware of those things. I don't know how much I read about specific incidents or gestures.
Okay. But that's a kind of red flag that you're talking about.
Yes.
And you said, despite that, there's only one reported meeting with a psychologist for any purpose.
Correct, so far as I know.
Okay. Had he come from a different personal world, whether it's psychological or family world, how would his relationship skills be different? How would they be different?
Well, that's something we can only speculate, but you would hope that if he had come out of a world where he was treated with mutual respect, had been given reason to believe in himself and so forth, that certainly would have impacted the way he acted and reacted to other people, how he could groom favorable relationships with others, and feel that he had a place of significance in his life.
And are those areas, we talked about possible growth areas earlier, are those the kind of growth areas that Brandon is still capable of making?
Those opportunities will always be available to him, regardless of what setting he finds himself in.
So that brings us to the next bullet. Is he forever destined to just be a depressed person who is stuck in a certain place?
Right. And that's an important consideration. Is he destined to be forever depressed, forever avoidant, forever confused?
And what do we think? Is it possible to get beyond those things? And if so, how do we get beyond those things?
It is possible. Now, if I could offer in a few brief words how to do that, I could write a book and retire a millionaire, and that would be that. But that's a big question. But the point is that you're making, and I would corroborate, is that people can change. They are not forever destined to fall into and stay in that dark world that Brandon has been in.
And the prison system, we heard testimony yesterday, they are able to provide psychiatric care in terms of getting psychiatric medications.
Right. He'd get medication if he needed it and would take it.
What about counseling, 12-step programs, peer support groups? Are those types of things available to your knowledge?
Typically, the chaplain's offices at most all of the prisons offer services of that nature. One of the unfortunate things about our prison system is there's not enough emphasis on treatment, but there are opportunities available through those kind of peer support groups and so forth.
What about maintaining relationships through correspondence and through artwork that you're sending out to family members, for instance?
Your contact with the outside world obviously is going to be limited, but whatever relationships he has with people outside of the prison system can certainly be supportive to him while he's in the prison system. And if he has some reason to believe in himself, well, then that's to his advantage.
The next to last bullet point then discusses Brandon's actions and what kind of conclusions did you draw?
Right. And I posed the question, so are Brandon's actions those of a hardened man with a high need for power and vengeance, or those of a maladjusted, emotionally hurt, avoidant man who is ill-prepared for adulthood? And I think that my response to that is inherent in the question. I think he is the latter. So which is worse and which is more capable of change? And again, I think that the response, or my response, would be inherent in the question that a person who was mal-shaped by his environment, who was not given the support he needed, hopefully would be more capable of making changes than one who's hardwired to be bad.
And it sounds like you're saying that your feeling about Brandon is that he's not the latter, not hardwired to be bad, that type of person.
Right.
The last point you make is, does Brandon have the capacity to someday live and work in society without posing a threat to others.
Which isn't it?
Now, let me stop you before we do this. You've not done any kind of threat assessment, evaluation, any kind of these checklists or anything like that are really designed for outside world type threat assessment. You haven't done anything like that.
Correct.
And that's because I asked you not to do that.
Right.
And there are some valid reasons why you wouldn't want to do that on a person who's going to be in an incarcerated setting for a long period of time. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Can you explain that to the jury?
When he is incarcerated, he won't have access to drugs, at least to the extent he would in the real world. There won't be the girlfriend-boyfriend conflicts. The family relationship problems he had, he's going to be isolated from all that just like everybody else is. Many of the things that influenced him and pushed him into a negative state during his childhood, youth, early adulthood will be absent from him, particularly the substance abuse problems.
Because he'll be in an incarcerated setting.
Right, and he will be told, this is your room and this is what your schedule is and so forth. So it'll be a more structured environment.
Okay. And a lot of the risk factors that led to our incident occurring are simply absent.
Right, he doesn't have the freedom to make a lot of choices that he could make outside of prison.
And can a person with Brandon's limitations that you talked about, will he be able to respond well to a structured incarcerated type setting?
If he so chooses, he can.
Okay. Or he could choose to act out and not follow the rules.
Right, and there are provisions for that.
Okay. And you've done parole work, correct?
Yes.
So you understand that the prison system has tremendous very range of behavior modification tools.
Right.
And it's in their interest to have a peaceful and well-oiled machine in the prison system.
Yes.
And have you seen them make steps to make sure that people are classified appropriately?
Yes.
And that's partially a risk management tool.
Yes.
Which is not to say that there's no danger in prison.
Correct.
But do you think Brandon's a person who's capable of following the rules once he goes to that kind of structure?
Yes, if he so chooses.
Fair enough. Carmen, I approach this. Dr. Carter, I'm showing you now what I've marked as exhibits 15 and 16. And first, can you just say whether you recognize these two exhibits?
Yes, 15 is my curriculum vitae, and then Exhibit 16 is the PowerPoint presentation we just completed.
Okay. And so the curriculum vitae, does that reflect the things that you and I talked about and basically your professional qualifications?
Yes.
And does it fairly and accurately represent all those things?
Yes.
Did you prepare it, in fact, for bringing with you to testify today?
I keep my vita updated and get asked to see copies of it by different people from time to time, so it's something I do continuously.
Good, fair enough. And you brought it with you today?
Yes.
And same thing with the PowerPoint. Does this paper PowerPoint accurately reflect the one that we just watched up on the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, we would move for admission of 15 and 16. I previously showed it.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I do realize that you have not had lunch, so I am going to recess you for lunch before we forget about lunch. So it is about 5 minutes to 1. I'm going to ask you to be back at 2:15. You're in recess.